the reason why we're here, the reason why RentCover exists is to create certainty in a world of uncertainty. So effectively what that means is that there's just so much uncertainty in the world. People, don't trust insurers. And when we went through the process and a lot of research was done, we found we're actually different. We're actually different to everybody else, and we are actually there to help. We're there in times of need. And so really what we're doing there is creating certainty.
Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how on where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, and sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You'll hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested.
Hi Freedom Fighters. How do you cope with uncertainty? Does it cause you stress and sleepless nights? And how do you handle risk? And what about how much you value certainty? What would you be prepared to pay for it? These are questions that we often ask potential investors who are putting hundreds of thousands of dollars at risk in a property, but don't realise they need to get landlord insurance. Or if they do, they just get the cheapest policy they can get from the supermarket or a generalist insurer. Or worse still, they don't think it's worth getting insurance at all. And the strange thing is that specialised landlord insurance only costs a few $100s a year. But if you take out a specialist policy from a specialist landlord insurance provider, it significantly reduces and minimises the costs associated with the loss of rent or damage caused by tenants. Now, I'm not talking about the so-called landlord insurance policies offered at your local supermarket or by the big insurers, as most of these policies are a waste of time, as they may be cheaper, but they're still going to leave you financially exposed. Like anything these days, you don't get what you don't pay for, and landlord insurance is no different. Most general off-the-shelf landlord insurance policies rely on your bond money to cover any loss of rent or property damage caused by a tenant. And often, they don't pay out for months, meaning that you're left covering the costs in the meantime. This can be enough to tip you over the edge and ruin you financially. And let me be clear, it's not a matter of if the loss of rent or damage is going to occur to your property, but it's a matter of when. So for me, spending a few dollars on a specialised landlord insurance policy is well worth the peace of mind as well as the financial protection of your highest value assets. As a long-term investor focused on capital growth, property investment needs to be safe and affordable to maintain. In this regard, ongoing cash flow affordability and consistently is absolutely critical to your ability to survive and thrive long-term. And any significant loss of rent for a period of time can prove to be financially devastating. As the world's most successful investor Warren Buffett once famously said, "I put a heavy weight on certainty. If you do that, the whole idea of risk factor doesn't make any sense to me. Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing." And as I discuss in my book, The Freedom Formula, your fears about risk are born out of your emotional response to your perception of uncertain, unknown, or uncontrollable risks. The emphasis here is on emotion and perception. Fear is the distressing emotion aroused by real or imagined anticipation of loss, pain, or anger. In other words, Fear is based on a lack of control of our feelings resulting from uneducated thoughts over the potential impact and uncertainty of the unknown. Generally, fear arises out of ignorance. So if you simply increase your knowledge of the subject of your fears, it's possible to identify the real probability and impact of potential risks, come up with contingency plans to accommodate them, and then eliminate your fear. Fear and risk are also strongly affected by trust, particularly in an area where you have little knowledge and experience. Fear comes from not knowing who you can trust to give you unbiased, objective information that is looking after your interests, not someone else's. So the keys here are knowledge and trust. A key element of risk protection, knowledge and trust for property investors is to ensure that you've got the right specialised landlord insurance policy. When you don't know what you don't know, you may be exposing yourself to risks that you're not even aware of. Let me give you an example. A tenant fell into a rental arrears and vacated the property. In the final inspection, the property manager found multiple stains on the carpet throughout the house, broken blinds, the vinyl in the kitchen had been torn from moving the fridge, there were multiple small holes and divots in walls throughout, some from the door handles, knife marks on the kitchen bench top, hair dye stains on the ensuite vanity, and torn flying screens on some of the windows. This accidental damage repair, along with the loss of rent, total costs of over $17,430. Now, an off-the-shelf landlord insurance policy would only cover a fraction of these costs, while a specialist landlord insurer will cover the lot. In another instance, a property manager attended an investment property in Sydney to conduct an inspection, only to find that there's blood all over the place. The police were called, and after extensive and time-consuming investigations that prevented the property from being rented for months, murder was finally ruled out and it was confirmed that the tenant had taken their own life. The forensic cleaning and minor damage costs, which, together with the loss of rent, totalled over $25,000. The specialist landlord insurance policy that was in place covered all of these costs. And if you think that insurance is not worth the investment, or that insurers are looking for an excuse not to pay, check out these stats with EBM RentCover, the company that we personally use for landlord insurance on all of our properties. EBM RentCover has settled more than 6,250 claims in the last 12 months, worth a whopping $24 million in payouts. For the mathematically inclined, that's around 24 claims every business day, with an average payout of about $3,800. And for the cynical amongst you who think insurers are always trying to find loopholes to avoid paying claims or drag them out for months, which is the case with many of the generalist insurance providers, a very impressive 93% of all claims submitted were paid, and many within 5 working days. Now, as some of you may know, my awesome wife Sonia owned and ran a very successful property management business for over 12 years, and she got to see the good, the bad, and the downright ugly when it came to tenant-related rent and damage issues, and the tremendously variability in the level of support, care, responsiveness, and performance of landlord insurance policies. So today, I want to open your eyes to the importance of specialised landlord insurance. And there's no better person to talk you through this than today's guest, Sharon Fox-Slater. Sharon has worked in the industry for more than 30 years, and she's well equipped and passionate about delivering insurance solutions and outstanding service that better protects your investments and your income. Very proudly, Sharon joined EBM way back in 1993 and was part of the core team that helped launch one of Australia's first specialised landlord insurance policies into the market. Since then, she's worked tirelessly to transform EBM RentCover from a small startup into a national operation of more than 100 employees who work hard to educate property professionals and protect more than 150,000 property owners. Now, I can say from personal experience that at the heart of Sharon's business is a team of amazing specialists who operate with integrity and honesty. values that you don't typically associate with insurers. And as is obvious from this week's opening, EBM RentCover appreciate that insurance is about providing certainty in times of uncertainty by educating and empowering you to understand the true value of properly protecting your investment properties. Today, you'll learn what investors and landlords should look for with landlord insurance policies, what are the risks that landlord insurance mitigates, and what is and isn't covered, along with a host of other really interesting insurance considerations. You will then be able to assess whether you have the right landlord insurance to cover your risks. And if you haven't got a landlord insurance policy through a specialist provider like EBM, and you're not aware of the financial risk you're exposed to with a generalist policy, then email us here at hello@khgroup.com.au. That's HELLO at khgroup.com.au, and we'll help point you in the right direction. In the meantime, enjoy this eye-opening and ear-opening chat with Sharon Fox-Slater. Hi, Freedom Fighters. Now, for those of you who know me well, as an investor, you're aware of how much importance I place on landlord insurance to minimise cost and risk, particularly when holding a property long term. And I'm not just talking about any old landlord insurance policy that you can pick up at the supermarket or through the big insurers, but I'm talking about specialist landlord insurers. So today, we're very pleased to be joined by the Managing Director of the leading landlord insurer in Australia, in our opinion, and that's EBM RentCover. So welcome, and let's get invested, Sharon.
Hi, so I'm Sharon Fox-Slater, Managing Director, EBM RentCover, and I have been working with property investors and property professionals for almost 30 years to help them better understand the importance of insurance.
Yeah, awesome. Now, it's a subject that a lot of people don't put a lot of attention on, but before we sort of drill into the nitty-gritties of that, Sharon, I'd love you to sort of take us back through your journey so far and focus on what you've invested your time, energy, money and resources in, what you've learnt from it, what were some of the pitfalls, and how has that led you to be where you are today?
Okay, so when I first started out working with investment properties, there was really only our product and one other product coming out of South Australia. And for the first couple of years, we didn't do too well. We realised that we didn't really know what we were doing, and we were sort of, churning out policies and then not really looking after people when it came to making a claim. So through a lot of trial and error, we were able to sort of really focus on the claims process, because at the end of the day, that's when people need you most, when something has gone wrong. And so through there, we basically worked on making sure that we really look after people when it comes to their rental insurance. So effectively, I've invested my time and money into the RentCover business. It is the number one investment that I've made. But over the years, I have invested in a number of rental properties. Again, some of it through trial and error, and some of it through good research, and some of it through working with really good real estate agents. So going through that process myself gave me a much better understanding what investors should and shouldn't know when it comes to protecting their properties.
Yeah, let's delve in there a little bit, if you can, to share some of the war stories and the trials and tribulations that you may have been through on that, because I know you started life in WA. And did you get involved personally in property in WA at that stage or not?
No, I didn't. I grew up in WA and was working out of the EBM office there for 5 years doing rental insurance, and then I moved over to Melbourne, because obviously we have got a big market in the East Coast. And in order to properly look after everybody nationally, it just made sense that we had an office based on the East Coast. And it wasn't until I moved to Melbourne that I bought my first investment property, which was in Victoria. And I bought it because it was cheap. And it seemed like a good idea at the time. And it turned out that it was a bad idea because it was not in a good area, which meant that the tenant selection wasn't great. Yeah. And, it didn't sort of go up in value. And in actual fact, I made a loss when I eventually sold it, realising that it was a bad decision.
Yeah, okay. And we'll sort of zigzag a little bit between your personal property experience and the beginnings of your journey in insurance. Can I ask, how did you fall into the insurance area in the first place? How did that come about?
So it's interesting that you use the words, how did you fall into? Nearly everybody in the insurance industry fell into it by accident. I finished school at year 10. I didn't really like school very much. And my parents said, well, you have to do something. So I decided that I would go to business school for 12 months and that I would get myself an office job. So that was my plan. Yeah. And I applied for hundreds and hundreds of office jobs in all sorts of industries. And I ended up being offered 2 jobs on the same day. One was with a company called Mercantile Mutual, and the other one was with RACWA, and both of them were in insurance. So I was obviously destined to be in insurance.
Yeah, clearly. So which one did you take and why?
So it was a difficult decision. One was actually specialising in home insurance, and the other one was specialising in motor vehicle claims. Okay. So they were quite different, and, being a sort of young 17-year-old, I didn't really know what insurance was, and decided that the RAC was a well-known household brand, and so I decided to go with that option. And I have to say it was a great decision. It was a really good place for me to sort of get my learning and understanding about the insurance industry. Yeah. I was with them for nearly 4 years, and I specialised in motor vehicle claims and household claims. And, of course, the advantage with doing claims is that you have a real understanding about what people are going through when something goes wrong.
Yes.
So that was a great place for me to start.
Great. Yeah, I can imagine you're right at the coalface, and you're dealing with the emotions that people are going through at that quite challenging time for them. So probably a baptism of fire, but a great place to really grind the teeth and really get a sense of what the insurance game's all about. So how did that then lead into EBM?
Okay, so from there, I then decided that I would move on, and I took my knowledge to a company which was called Taxi Insurance, which was doing insurance for taxi drivers.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It was very interesting and challenging at the same time. The company was actually a lot smaller than what I was used to. It was only 4 people working in the office, and we didn't have computers. We actually had the old sort of paperwork filing system. So, taxi drivers had an accident, he would come in and you'd have to pull the drawer out and, manually look for the little card that had his information written down in pencil so that you could rub it out.
I love it. That's awesome.
Yeah. So I stayed there for about 12 months and decided that really wasn't for me. But what was interesting in my time there, that was actually based in West Perth. I used to walk up the road to get my lunch every day.
Is it Hay Street? You're in Hay Street?
No, so it was actually on Wellington Street. So I'd walk up Outram Street, and there was this beautiful building that was being built, which was actually on the corner of Outram and Wellington Street. It was a really out there building, very modern. So each day I would sort of stand in front of it and watch with interest as they built this place, and even watch them carry in the boardroom table and leather lounge chairs and things like that. And I said to...
you could see yourself there, could you?
I just said, wow, look at that building. I wonder what they do in there. Wouldn't it be amazing to work for a company like that? But I'm never going to be smart enough to do something like that. And anyway, I then from taxi insurance moved off, and I worked for an insurance broker for a couple of years, which was out in Midland.
Yep.
And I did all sorts of insurance there, from weddings to there was a boat race called the Avon Descent. I did insurance for that.
Okay.
And I had a really terrific mentor, that the broker that I worked for, he just taught me so many things about the industry, and learning a variety of different insurances was terrific. And then I decided that I would like to have a job a little bit closer to home because Midland wasn't really that close to where I lived to. And so I went to a recruitment company and they said, yeah, we've got this job that we would think that you would be great for. They'd like to interview you. So I said, no problem. And I jumped in a taxi because I didn't know exactly where it was and pulled up to the address. And lo and behold, it was actually that building that I saw being built. And I couldn't believe my eyes and thought, gee, wow, what am I doing here? This is crazy. And I walked in and this beautiful staircase going up the middle of the building, and I was so nervous. And then the receptionist said, okay, you can go upstairs. Mr. Adams is ready to see you now. And I had one of the strangest interviews that I've ever had in my life, which was him saying, hello, I'm Jeff. Nice to meet you. And when can you start? And I said, would you like to ask me some questions first? And he said, no, not at all. Your old boss is a great mate of mine. So when I saw that that's where you'd worked, I gave him a call, and he couldn't speak highly enough of you. He said, I just needed to make sure that you looked all right.
I love that. And I reckon there's a bit of the old law of attraction in play there. I'm a big believer in that. So you visualised the building, you saw yourself sitting in there, and it's suddenly landed in your lap there, Sharon. So
yeah, couldn't believe my luck. So I started there 2 weeks later, and when I turned up on Monday morning, I had no idea what I was actually employed to do. So that was the beginning of my journey into insurance for rental properties, and well, I still love it as much today as I did back then.
Yeah, and let's talk about why, because what I'm hearing about what you're saying is that you've had a lot of very early exposure to niche insurance areas, and that's a rarity in itself. And you've let's face it, landlord insurance, there couldn't possibly be any greater variety that comes in with property investment across any insurance class, I would have thought. So you've obviously got an absolute passion for it, and your passion and your talent is carried you a long way in a very short space of time in the industry, Sharon, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But why do you still love it so much?
Because there isn't, no one day is the same. Everything is different. And no matter how long you've been doing this type of insurance, you're always faced with something new and different. You can never know it all, so you continue to learn and grow and develop as a person. The team that I have continue to grow and develop. The network of clients and investors continues to grow and develop. And I suppose I really enjoy it because I know that every day we're actually helping people to protect what's important to them. We understand why, people invest in rental properties. It's interesting to see how that landscape sort of has changed over the years, and the different trends that occur. I just think it's a really exciting place to be. And for me, starting out with a product and a portfolio that was brand new and sort of building and developing it, makes it truly your own because you're just so personally invested in it. And, really we just want to make sure that we can help people and look after people. That's what it's about.
And you've been, given the time and the rise of your career in conjunction with really helping to actually build that industry, along with one of your early South Australian competitors, yourself and them have really shaped the landlord insurance industry as a whole, I would say, looking in from the outside.
Yeah, that would be 100% correct. Spot on.
Yeah, what I love about what I'm hearing, it's very similar to the pathway of my good wife Sonia, who, like yourself, school couldn't hold her attention. And you strike me in the little bit of interaction we've had. You strike me as someone who learns very quickly, picks things up, not scared to ask any question, and we'll keep asking you until you get an answer that satisfies, and have no sense of barriers or fear around asking anyone anything. Would I be reading that correctly?
You would be, absolutely. And it's also, I think, really important to recognise that there are things that you don't know, and it's difficult because you don't know what you don't know. But if you surround yourself with good people and diversity that need to obviously be positive and engaging, it's really, really important to sort of ask when you don't know or ask when you need help.
Because you've risen from that interview with Jeff, I'm not sure how many years ago, to now being the managing director of EBM RentCover. That's a miraculous ride, and there's clearly a loyalty exercise there with you as well, or tied up with the fact that you just love the company so much and they've given you so much scope to grow this that it's worked for both of you. Where does that all sit?
Yeah, no, that's actually right. I do love the company. It's a great company, and I'm actually not the only person in the business with that sort of longevity. We've got a couple of other managing directors who specialise in some other areas, and they're all the same sort of time frame as me. And I guess it was good. There was 19 people in the business when I started, and there's a core group that's still around, and we've always got on well. We don't work together in the sense of we're not in the same businesses, but we all support each other and help each other out. And at the end of the day, we've been really well looked after, and in turn we've looked after the business. But then the opportunity to be able to actually become a shareholder and invest our own personal money just sort of connects you even more, and, just sort of really, evokes you to want to strive even harder. Yeah,
well, I guess the great news about that is that the directors or the management of the companies clearly recognise you as someone who they want to be part of the action, and sharing the opportunity for you to become a shareholder in it is a two-way recognition, and a great way really to build that loyalty and that commitment that you've clearly always had. So, and I can hear the pride in your voice in relation to EBM and what it does. And as a consumer, Sharon, as personal investors who have used EBM for some time now, we can certainly commend you on the culture that you've built around each and every interaction with people at any level within EBM. It's all about exactly what you've said. There's a real care that comes through, and they're wanting to help and get things done. So I'd fully commend you on building such a strong culture in that regard. It's a pretty rare commodity in this day and age.
It certainly is, and thank you. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we look after everyone, and I've got a fantastic team of people that I work with who care about our clients as much as I do, which is terrific, because we're all turning up to work every day to do the same thing, and we all have the same goals, which makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, no, I totally agree. Now, let's just sort of zigzag back into your own personal property journey for a minute. So your first property, bad area, obviously learned a few things. It's somewhere in or around Melbourne, I'm guessing. Where did that lead you to in terms of your own property journey?
So after obviously that bad experience, I did something else which maybe wasn't so smart. I actually saw a property online. It was up in Queensland, and I hadn't seen it. The real estate agent that was selling it was a client of ours.
Okay.
And so I gave the principal a call, explained who I was, and he said, look, if you go ahead and buy this property, I guarantee that I will have a tenant for you on the day of settlement. And I thought, I think that maybe he's just telling me that because he wants to sell me the property. Yeah. But true to his word, I bought the property, it settled, and I had a tenant on day one, and I then had that tenant for 7 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was actually a really good investment. I left the property management with that same business, and it was actually the principal's wife that ran the property management section, okay. And it was a really great relationship. between myself, the agency, and also the tenant. He was a great tenant. I looked after him. He looked after me. He would really go out of his way to look after the property. He would sort of say to the agency, look, it could do with a bit of a paint. If Sharon actually buys the paint, I'd actually paint it for her, so I wasn't paying for the labour. So we had this really great relationship, and so that one worked out really well for me. I sat at it for 7 years and then decided it was time to sell it. And
why did you sell, can I ask?
Just because the property was starting to get a bit older, and the amount of money that I needed to pay out for maintenance was starting to creep up, because, it's obviously really important to make sure that you do maintain a property. And because at that point I was also then looking at putting my money into EBM instead. Yeah. So I needed to sort of free the money up. Yeah, so
the good news I'm hearing here, and this is a pretty common story, and one that I think is a bit of an invisible benefit, really, in that property can create equity that then allows you to invest in other things. And if the opportunity came for you to invest personally in EBM and back yourself and back the company, but the property in Queensland really gave you the means to be able to do that, then that's a secondary ongoing investment benefit that property allows you. Would I be right in saying that?
Absolutely. Yep, that's correct. And I have obviously subsequently gone on and do have other types of property. My husband and I have got, our family home that we live in. We have a little holiday property. We've got a commercial property now over in WA, and an apartment over there as well. So we've got a variety of different things. So, I think that property is a good area to invest your money in.
Yeah, well, why do you say that? Why is property something that you're comfortable investing in?
Because if you buy the right property in the right area with good tenants, you really won't go wrong in terms of losing money. Most of the good areas tend not to really go backwards, and even if they do, so WA is actually a good example because the economy is not great over there and property prices are sort of rock bottom. But that is now starting to turn, and, you will have seen this. It goes in cycles, so if you can actually just stick with it through the bad times, it will turn around.
No question. And in fact, it's interesting you say that. We're contrarian investors, and we look very closely at those cycles that happen in certain locations, and we're actually looking very closely at some opportunities in Perth as we speak, Sharon, because we believe that it's coming off the bottom. The rental vacancies have dropped quite substantially in a number of areas, and there's now, as a long-term investor, and I'm talking investors that are investing for 10 plus, more like 15 and maybe 20 years, Perth is a very ripe zone right now for all the reasons you've just mentioned.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, that's great. So you got some real clarity around your own property experience and what you've managed very successfully to do with EBM. I'd love now to really jump into the subject of landlord insurance, because from my own perspective and the clients that we've looked after over the years and others that could be or would be clients, what never ceases to amaze me, Sharon, is the number of people who don't really acknowledge the benefit of insurance. And if they do, it's all about getting the cheapest price rather than a policy that's really going to do the job. What's your experience been around that, and what would you say to our listeners in that regard?
That I understand insurance is a grudge buy. Nobody really wants to pay for it because you don't really see any value in it at the point of purchase. A lot of people know that you should have it. There is also confusion around exactly what you should have. People think if they buy an apartment, the body corporate's got strata insurance and therefore they've got cover, which obviously isn't right. But people would rather spend, their time and money researching a flat screen TV and paying for that as opposed to insurance because they just don't see the value in it. So we're obviously about trying to, help people understand why they should have it and what the value is, which is obviously when a claim occurs. People that have had claims will tell you, I'm so glad that I had this insurance policy and that I was protected and I was helped through the process. Because when something goes wrong, a lot of people also don't know what to do.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I guess and let's just for those listeners who may not have invested yet or have only just invested and haven't really spent much time thinking about insurance, I just wanted to talking to the basics. Landlord insurance is very different from building insurance and contents insurance. So perhaps, Sharon, I'll just get you to expand on where landlord insurance fits and what it effectively covers and doesn't cover, just so that those listeners that are at that stage of the journey have got a clearer picture, if you don't mind.
Sure. So effectively, building and contents insurance it covers what's called insured events. So fire, storm, fusion, those sorts of things. They're standard that are covered in all building and contents policies, and they are standard in landlord building and contents policies. There are a number of insurers out there that say that they cover landlords and that their policy is a landlord insurance policy, but it's only a variation on a building and contents policy. When you actually go to a specialist landlord provider, the things that they cover are directly related to the tenancy and things that will go wrong in the rental property. So they cover loss of rent, damage caused by a tenant, legal fees if you've got to go to court, death of a tenant, legal liability if something should happen to the tenant or one of their guests. So it is specifically geared towards the risks that landlords face with a rental property.
Yeah, I just sort of expanding on what you've said there. What I see as the issues that a lot of investors don't think about when they just see landlord. If they do get landlord insurance, they just see it's the old that must all be the same, so I'll just get the cheapest price. Where I see a lot of people coming to grief, and my wife owned and ran a successful property management business for many years, and while she would see them with the benefits of going with a specialist provider like yourself, quite often the big insurance companies would entice them with what appeared to be a cheap policy, but you get what you pay for. And the biggest fault I saw with, and continue to see with a lot of those policies, is that there's a very high reliance on the bond to cover any shortfall in costs caused by tenant issues. And for anyone who's been in the investment space for long enough, if you've got an issue and you have to end up in a tribunal, then at best you're probably going to be there in 3 months, and you've still got the mortgage dragging a big cost out of your pocket every month. Costs can run away pretty substantially and put you in a financially difficult position if you haven't got yourself the right sort of policy. Can you talk a little bit more about where EBM fits into that and the sorts of protections they're likely to get by adopting one of your policies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that risk that you've just highlighted there, which is if you've got to go to court, is probably one of the least known, least thought about areas when it comes to landlord insurance. Most people think, I need rent default, which you do. You need cover for rent default. But where you do really need it is when you're caught up in that situation where you need an eviction to get the tenant out of the property. So our policies, in that situation, our policies cover you up to 52 weeks. So you cover for a year. And that may seem excessive, but we've seen cases where there's been a backlog in the court system and people, haven't been able to get there for 6 or 7 months.
Yeah.
So in that, which is obviously, no one can foresee that because you don't know what's going on in the court system. That's where you really need that cover, because how else are you going to pay your mortgage?
Exactly. And unfortunately, there are some very well-educated tenants who know how the system works, and they can manoeuvre things around the tribunal process to make it drag out for months and months and months. So if you haven't got that protection, you can suddenly find yourself in a very tight financial position because no one anticipated that. But what about some of the other risks that you've come across? You mentioned the death of a tenant, and I'll say with my wife's property management business, she saw that happen. And talk us through perhaps an example or a scenario where that's occurred and the timeframes and the costs that have accumulated around that, and where insurance may have been a saviour in that regard.
Yeah, so we actually had one not that long ago where the tenant just passed away in their sleep, so there was nothing untoward with that. They obviously, nobody realised that this had happened, so the property manager found them a couple of weeks later, which is not nice. But they then couldn't get hold of the next of kin. So, they spent quite some time trying to locate them because they needed to do something with the tenant's belongings.
Yes.
In the end, because you can't just get rid of them. So in the end, they ended up putting the tenant's contents into storage, and so we were paying for the loss of rent on that. I think it ended up going on for about 6 months, and they ultimately couldn't find anyone. So there's a period of time that you've actually got to hold on to the belongings, which they did that for, but effectively the property couldn't be rented out either. So aside from obviously the cleanup costs, we consider that type of cleanup as accidental damage. Because it's not just standard cleaning. And then, the loss of rent was paid. And again, in that situation, we cover up to 52 weeks as well. But, that's the last thing that anyone would think about. Oh, should something unfortunate happen to the tenant? What if I can't get hold of anybody? And those sorts of things happen, and you just don't really think about needing to have that loss of rent covered, and obviously having the cleanup covered. And we've also had sort of some circumstances that are not nice, where people, we've had a number over the years where the tenant's been murdered, and, the police become involved, and they've got to obviously carry out their investigations. It's a crime scene. The property obviously can't be cleaned up or rented out until they've finished with their investigations. And again, sometimes that can go on for months. So that's another situation where you want to make sure that you've got a decent amount of protection for the loss of rent, and also again for the cleanup. Like that's forensic cleanup, which again, costs thousands and thousands of dollars. It's just not a normal cleaning job.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And these are things that, and I'll reinforce with the listeners. It's not a matter of if it's going to happen; it's a matter of when it's going to happen. And if you're going into investment property with your eyes open, you're acknowledging that these things are going to occur. You just want to make sure that you are protected when that does happen, so that you're not financially and emotionally disadvantaged. So one of the other things I think I'd love to delve on a little bit, because you mentioned it very early in the discussion, was the claims process. Because we're as in our property management business, we've seen issues occur. Is that yes, the policy might be okay, but if the payment process drags out for months, which with some of the big insurers it can, because, let's face it, an insurance policy is looking for a reason to say why they don't have to pay the insurance. So there can be a very lengthy process in that. And we've seen landlords that have gone for the supermarket specials or the big company blanket insurance policies, where it does take months and months before it does get paid out, and in the meantime, same drill. The mortgage still has to be paid. The expenses are still there. How does EBM treat that claims process in that regard? Can you sort of give us a little bit more around that?
Yeah, the good thing is that, for me personally, I've been doing this for a long time, and I oversee every department of RentCover, including the claims department, and what we care about most when somebody needs to make a claim is actually looking after them. We certainly don't look for a way not to pay a claim. We actually look for a way to pay it. And what we then do is, if it's unclear as to whether something should be paid or not, we always then go back to, well, what was the intent of the policy? The wording may specifically say something, but was the intention behind that particular clause to cover a loss like this? And if it was, we would pay it. So I can give you an example of that, and that's actually with Mascot Towers.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so we had a number of properties in there that we insured, and the whole building was obviously evacuated. Nobody could stay there. It was falling apart, and most insurance policies actually don't cover structural defects. So there certainly could have been the ability to decline claims under that. However, the landlords of those properties didn't have sort of any involvement in what went on in the building. We don't know exactly what went wrong. We don't know exactly what happened. These people have got no rent coming in and they've got mortgages to pay. The intent of the policy is actually to cover them for something sudden and unforeseen in terms of accidental damage. And it is the intention to pay loss of rent for an unforeseen circumstance. So our clients actually had loss of rent cover, which we actually did under something called prevention of access. So prevention of access is where a government authority says that you basically can't live in the property. So we actually sort of looked at that clause as a way to pay those claims, as opposed to we could have fallen onto the technicality of it's a structural defect, but we didn't do that, and we wouldn't do that. We look for ways to pay so that, you know, people feel that we're there for them when they need us.
And I can back that up firsthand. I've seen investors that, we can't advise people to use a certain company. We certainly make them aware of what the options are. And for those investors who've been smart enough to insure with you, I can say firsthand how good that experience has been. Because you're right. I think the only one now left in the game that is looking for how can we pay this and how can we pay this quickly, versus how can we get out of this? Where's the loophole? So no, that's awesome. A couple of things I wouldn't mind delving into as well, because they're sort of growing trends that I'm seeing with investment properties. Firstly, there's a prevalence of the drug culture that's following the ice epidemic that's out there. Have you seen any issues related around that have resulted in claims in terms of damage to properties and other that you'd like to share?
We certainly have, and we've seen an increase in the number of drug lab claims, but it's not. There were a number of people in the industry that were sort of saying it's an epidemic and calling for drug testing to happen at every single property inspection. We certainly aren't seeing anywhere near that sort of number that would require that sort of a response.
Okay.
But when a claim does occur, it is expensive. And the reason why it's expensive is because, again, you've actually got to have forensic cleaning done. You've got to have cleaners that can go in there. They've got to wear specialised suits, and sometimes part of the property will have to be demolished and replaced. Normally it's in kitchens, bathrooms and laundries. The claims on average would be sort of between $40,000 and $50,000 for restoration. So, again, you want to make sure that you've got some good cover. Not a lot of people do cover that type of loss, and we also have seen policies where they limit it to $10,000 or $20,000, which obviously isn't enough. But again, we're not seeing it from any specific area in Australia. We've got claims coming from most states, but they're not through the roof, but they're there.
Yeah, that's interesting. What other trends are you seeing in terms of the types of claims that are either up or down that you've seen shift in recent times?
The one thing that's always been constant and we haven't seen any change in is just good old, rent default. Something happens and the tenant can't pay their rent. We have seen an increase in the number of what we call denial of access claims. So that is where the tenants won't leave and you've got to get an eviction to get them out. Again, we tend to see that sort of thing more when the economy is right down. So Western Australia is a good example of that because, people haven't got money and not paying their rent and they haven't got anywhere to go. So we understand the reasons why it's occurring. But again, these things do often go in cycles and, often actually squatters is another one that we saw a little bit of a few years ago, both in WA and Queensland. And again, that was to do with the economy. But you sort of see those sorts of claims go through a bit of a spike and then it settles back down and then it's just your normal, rent and tenant damage claims in the main. we always do get extraordinary things that you don't expect. But of course, the other thing that we see arising, which no one can control, but it's obviously the natural disasters, floods, fires, hailstorms. They're the big ones at the moment.
Yeah, which it's certainly, if we're talking certain areas of Queensland and the bushfires in New South Wales, it certainly seems to be a growing intensity in some of that activity in recent years, and everyone's got a reason for why that might be the case. But certainly, from an insurance perspective, if you're investing in property, then you want to be protecting yourself from as many of those potential issues as you possibly can. Tell me about one of the things that Airbnb is become a much more widespread exercise, and I think it's certainly challenging some of the legislation in parts. Are there any issues around insurance for those that do have a property that they lease for Airbnb that they need to be aware of from that perspective?
So a lot of insurance policies won't cover that sort of short-term letting. We do have a short-term policy which is specifically designed to cover those sorts of rentals. If you have a property which is purely being rented out on a short-term basis, on a regular basis, there's not an issue. Obviously, that's insured. Where we see the issues arising is if tenants are subletting, so they might rent out a room through Airbnb. If a landlord says that that's okay, your insurance won't cover you because insurers don't really want to cover subletting situations because you don't know what you're covering. You want to know what the risk is. So if it's a known short term, no issues. If it's a sublet and you approve it, it's not okay. But if the tenants were subletting and you didn't know about it, then your policy would cover you because it's an unforeseen event.
Aha. Okay.
Yeah, so,
interesting. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So let me take another example that I'm seeing a little bit of a shift and more popularity with, and that is where there's a sort of like a house sitting type arrangement where you might have tenants that are mobile because of work, and they might have a couple of pets, and they will get someone to house sit the property for the week or two that they mightn't be there. Where does that sit in the scheme of insurance from that perspective, Sharon?
Well, firstly, what we always say is that if there's actually a change in circumstances, that the tenant should obviously let the landlord property manager know that that's what's occurred, but you should also always check with the insurance. Again, with our policy in that situation, we cover their tenant or their invitees. So that would be considered an invitee. So the policy would cover that in the same way that they would if it was the tenant.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Really interesting. Actually, one other thing that I see a lot of, particularly first-time investors, trip themselves up a little bit with, is the difference between wear and tear versus damage. Can you perhaps expand on that? Because I'm sure you'd get to see a lot of so-called claims that probably fall into the wear and tear bracket versus actual damage. Can you shed some light on that?
Absolutely. So obviously you see wear and tear more often in a longer tenancy. So, if a tenant's been in a property for 1 or 2 years, there generally is wear and tear, which could be, scuff marks on floors or walls, even just moving furniture around where, it might just leave, a mark on the floor. A bed, with the bed and the mattress is rubbed up against the wall and it leaves a black mark. All those sorts of things are actually wear and tear because they've just occurred in the normal course of living in a property. They happen, obviously, where you're living in your own property, so you know what happens in your own house. The same thing happens for tenants living in a rental property. So it's reasonable to expect that there would be some wear and tear when you have an investment property.
Totally. And I guess what never ceases to amaze me is that people accept that in their own homes, but particularly when they built a new build investment property and it's pristine, when they see it and they put tenants in for 2, 3, 4 years and they go back and have a look and it has succumbed to normal wear and tear. The tends to be sometimes an expectation. Well, no, I want it back in the Taj Mahal condition that it was when I handed it over. So I know property managers have some interesting discussions around that, and the smart ones educate their landlords on the fact that wear and tear is part of the act and that isn't claimable. But is that a trend or anything that you've sort of seen filter through with any claims that come through to your desk?
Yeah, we see it a lot, and it's it's a subject that people tend to become quite emotional over, and as you say, particularly if it's a new build or recently renovated. But what we also see with some of the older properties is the houses that have suffered a lot of wear and tear, but also houses that haven't had any maintenance done. They're effectively trying to get the property renovated through their insurance claim. So that's quite challenging. But again, we believe if we educate people about insurance and what it's there for, and that we're really open and honest about what is and isn't covered, that then minimises the trauma when it comes to making a claim, because people know what the policy will and won't pay for. Yeah,
exactly. Now, just I guess to help the listeners who are probably pricking up their ears now that we've been talking about the sort of protection that you can get from a specialist landlord insurance policy. If the listeners are starting to go, righto, well, I want to go and have a look at this whole area, what are the key criteria and the things that they need to be looking out for when comparing one policy against another?
So, number one, they need to look at that loss of rent area, but look beyond just the rent default, because the rent default is not the big sort of loss that you would experience. It's actually for those other areas that we were talking about. If, the tenant's got to go to court, or if the property can't be lived in for some reason, that's a big one, to make sure you've got some decent loss of rent cover there. Mm-hmm. Obviously, accidental damage is another big one. Lots of policies don't cover accidental damage, and a lot of the time with good tenants, most of the damage is accidental. Nearly every policy covers malicious damage, but malicious damage is challenging because the tenant has to have deliberately damaged the property with the intent to damage the property, and most of the time that's not the case. So, there could be two tenants in a property and they've had an argument and it becomes violent, and as a result you end up with holes in walls. A lot of people think that's malicious damage, but it's actually not, because their intent was to hurt each other, not hurt the property. So that's a difficult one to prove. So if you've got accidental damage, that sort of gets you around having to prove the intent of the damage.
Very good point. Very good point. Yep, I like that.
Obviously making sure that you've got some decent legal liability. So that's when, somebody is injured or tenant's property is damaged through a fault of the landlord. Yeah. Legal expenses. So if you've got to go to court, that your legal expenses are covered. They're sort of the main ones that people don't look out for. And if they don't have a good policy, that's where they really end up out of pocket.
Yeah. What about the sub-level allowance? Because I hear a lot of people say, oh, yeah, we cover that. But it's not until you ask the hard question, well, how much do you cover, that you find out whether you're exposed or not. What's your thoughts around that?
The sub-levels, lots of policies have got them, and they could be anywhere. So in order to determine that, you actually have to go through sort of every section of the policy. But we do see a number out there that will say, for example, that they cover pet damage. And that's obviously something that's becoming more important with legislation changing in different places. They'll say, we cover pet damage. And so you think, oh, okay, that's good. But it's covered to $250 or $500 or $1,000, which isn't enough. No. If you've ruined floors and doors and skirtings, there can be tens of thousands of dollars of repairs. Exactly. Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Any other exclusions, excess limits, payment timeframes, that customer claiming exercise that you'd sort of like to highlight for prospective investors looking to get a good policy? Yeah, the excesses is a good one. All insurance policies will have an excess. Most of them will have it on the damage component, but again, we've seen some that have got excesses on loss of rent. The good policies don't have excesses on loss of rent, so that would be something definitely to check. And you're right on your comment about claims. It's always worth checking what an insurer's reputation is around that claims process, because you could have a great policy or a cheap policy, but if it's not going to turn your claim around in a reasonable amount of time, you end up out of pocket through the claims process because you're not actually covered for the amount of time that it takes to settle a claim. You're only actually covered for what the policy covers you for, the default period or loss of rent as a result of the damage. If the insurer took 6 months, that's not actually covered. So.
Yeah, exactly. One of the ones that it doesn't come up very often, but it does happen on occasion. You mentioned it in relation to the sort of economic impact that it has on tenants in particular, and that is a fact of life, where a tenant applies for hardship allowance and suddenly can't afford to pay the full rent, and they're protected, but potentially the landlord's going to be covering the gap. Where does that sit in relation to EBM in that regard?
So if a landlord's agreed to actually reduce the rent, that's not covered because you've obviously come to an agreement.
Yeah.
If there is a situation where the tenant's broken the lease and in order to re-rent the property, the rent is lower, if there was a continuation of the lease, you would then get the difference of that up until the policy limits. I know that sounds really confusing, but effectively you have to have suffered a loss from the tenant, and that is one that you've not agreed to, because if you've agreed to it, it's not really considered a loss.
Yes. Well, let me put some colour around that. So I'm renting a place from you, Sharon. All of a sudden I fall on hard times. I've got to get out. I just can't stay in the property, but I've got a lease for another 6 months, and it's my responsibility really to find another tenant. But that tenant's only prepared to pay $100 less a week for that 6 months. What we're saying is that under your policy, the landlord would be covered. You would cover that $100 a week gap.
We wouldn't cover it for the whole 6 months. We would actually cover it. So we would consider that just a rent default. So in our case, you're covered for up to 6 weeks, but it isn't just 6 weeks. It's like, okay, at full rent, the 6 week component would be your $600.
Yeah.
So we would actually calculate it so that you're getting the equivalent of 6 weeks for your shortfall.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Yeah, no, okay, that's brilliant. Again, it's those sorts of things that do occur. We're very open and honest to those investors that we look after around facilitating that process for them, and we just can't emphasise enough how important it is to have a good policy in play that is going to give you those contingencies so that you can sleep at night knowing that when that issue occurs that you are covered. Talk to us a little bit about, because a lot of people will think, well, gee whiz, this sounds absolutely fantastic, but I bet it's really expensive, and I bet I'll be paying a lot more for it over and above what I would be getting through the supermarket specials or the generalist insurance companies. Can you give us some sort of relativity around how EBM sits in that regard, Sharon?
Yeah, so for our what we call our straight sort of landlord's insurance policy, which is RentCover Ultra, which covers all of those tenant-related risks, the average premium is around $350 a year.
That's nothing.
Yeah, so it's not much.
And it's tax deductible.
If you expand that out because you need to protect the building, then that is dependent on, what the construction of the property, the location of the property. So that we have to do that one on a quote-by-quote basis because obviously every house is worth something different. But the landlord component is not expensive.
Yeah. No, awesome. Okay, been an awesome discussion around that. I'm going to want to come back to you personally again for a minute before I jump into the ambush round, if I can. And something that I continue to focus on and have a real personal interest in, Sharon, is long-term sustainable success. Now, I'm hearing from you that you continue to enjoy long-term sustainable success in your career with EBM, and you've obviously been investing in the business, but beyond that in terms of the property portfolio that you've collected. What do you believe is the secret to long-term sustainable success?
Well, number one, obviously, do your research, so know what it is that you're doing. But the other thing is, when it comes to property, at the end of the day, it's all about relationships. It's about, dealing with good people. So, dealing with a good real estate agent, dealing with a good property manager, making sure that you've got a good tenant. They're all actually just about having, really good relationships. So I do very much believe if you're dealing with good people, good things will happen.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I always have a theory that if I surround myself with people that are better than I am, then I don't have to worry so much. So, very good advice. Yet a lot of people, particularly in property, don't trust anyone. And I know early on I made a lot of mistakes when we started investing in property just for that very reason. And you just don't know what you don't know. And I found after having a few shaky issues, talking to the right people and getting them on board just made life a whole lot better.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
no, I love that. Okay, well, I want to switch into the ambush round where I'm going to get you to sort of machine gun dance a little bit here over the 5 top questions that the listeners all want to hear your opinions on. So first of those, Sharon, is what's your favourite quote and why?
My favourite quote is, "Any day above ground is a good day." And that is simply because I think that we forget to appreciate that, life is short. And, we need to make the most of it and actually enjoy it, sort of, just really take the time to be grateful for what you have and the people in your life. We've all got a lot to be grateful for.
100%. No, that's a good one. What about the top book that you'd recommend people read and why?
Top book that I would recommend, Jim Collins, Good to Great.
Yes.
That's all about, the right people in the right places being the foundation of greatness, which I think is terrific.
That is a cracking book, actually. We've used it a lot in our own business in terms of it gives them great frameworks on how to really shift your business from being good to sensational. No, that's good advice. What about, and this is a complete change in subject here, but it's something that a lot of Aussies consider they pay too much tax. What's the top thing that you've legally done to minimise the tax that you pay?
Minimise the tax that I pay. I actually make sure that I've got a really good accountant to advise me around that because that sort of thing is not my expertise, so I use an expert.
Yeah, spot on. Absolutely spot on. Now, swinging back into the investment arena for a minute then, Sharon, what's both the worst and the best piece of investment advice that you've ever received?
The worst piece is obviously that it's good to buy cheap properties. Again, you need to do your research. And the best piece of advice is just that, do your research and talk to the right people.
Yeah. No, it's no rocket science in it, but not many people still do the amount of research or associate themselves with the right team, because in our view, property is a game of finance and it's also an elite team sport. So you need to know your numbers and you need to have really good people around you to make sure that you're covered in all those areas. Final question in the ambush series. What's a personal habit that contributes most to your success so far, Sharon?
A personal habit? Well, to look after yourself and look after the people around you. I always try to do that. A lot of people are just always so busy, they don't have time to look after themselves and they don't always have time to look after the people around them. So that's something I try really hard to do every day.
Yeah, awesome. I guess that I can see that coming through in the interactions we have with your team. And you said at the outset, you've got a team of 100 now. That's a village. team. I sort of commend you that thinking that you've just expressed really does come across in each and every interaction we have with members of your team and our clients too, for that matter. So it really is worth its weight in gold in terms of that approach to life. So awesome. Last question then, Sharon. If I gave you a microphone that spoke to everyone in the world, and that's all 7.7 billion of us, and I gave you just 1 minute to talk, what would you say?
Insurance makes the world go round. Without insurance, nothing would operate. Planes wouldn't fly, buildings wouldn't be built. Nobody would take any risks. So don't underestimate the importance of insurance.
Brilliant. Fantastic advice. I love it. I love that. Now, if people want to, they've woken up to the value of getting specialist landlord insurance from EBM, what's the best way that they can contact you to make that happen?
The best way to do that is through our fantastic new website, rentcover.com.au. It's got all of our contact details on there, but it's also got an info centre which actually covers all sorts of topics, including a lot of what we've spoken about today. So I'll definitely go there and have a look at that. Yeah,
brilliant. Like you sort of mentioned to me that you've gone through a period of reflection in recent times to have a relook at you, and it's become evident in what you've spoken about during our discussion in terms of that true care for others around what you're doing. What else has come out of that exercise that would be relevant for the listeners to hear in terms of where EBM sees it and where you're heading?
It was a really interesting exercise to go through, and it took us about 18 months to sort of get through the whole thing. We were fortunate enough, we engaged with, one of the top companies in the world, which cost us a lot of money, but it was worth the investment. And ultimately what came through is that the reason why we're here, the reason why RentCover exists is to create certainty in a world of uncertainty. So effectively what that means is that there's just so much uncertainty in the world. People, don't trust insurers. And when we went through the process and a lot of research was done, we found we're actually different. We're actually different to everybody else, and we are actually there to help. We're there in times of need. And so really what we're doing there is creating certainty. And we actually do that through educating and empowering property professionals and property investors. And we also do that through our values, which is being honest to the core, simple, human, making things really easy for people. And so whilst that was who we are and what we were doing, to actually have sort of the words and values that the team could connect to, I think has actually made us even better, and that every single person in here actually strives to create a world of certainty for everyone that they interact with, which is terrific.
Absolutely love that. And the way that just flowed, Sharon, tells me that the work you've done personally and as a group, because the language that you just used, I really connected to what you just said. It made perfect sense to me and really summed up for me how I would describe EBM being different from every other insurance company in your space. So, some great work done there. And we go through a similar exercise on a regular basis within our business, because it's very easy when you're working in the industry to get so tied up in your own internal jargon, and you sort of don't see the wood for the trees. Whereas getting someone to poke their head in from the outside and take it from an outsider's perspective can often get you to use language and recognise things that you otherwise wouldn't. So you've done some brilliant work there. That sounds like it was worth every cent you spent.
It was, thank you.
Brilliant work. Well, look, it's been really good. I really appreciate you spending your time. The listeners are going to get enormous value out of the discussion we've had around the importance of landlord insurance. Really thank you, and look forward to staying in touch. And we'll have you back at some stage, because this is an area that I still believe a lot of Australian investors don't put enough energy into. We might sort of go through some case studies in more detail that really open people's eyes to the things that do occur when you own property.
Terrific. That sounds great. Thank you very much for talking to me, Bushy.
Thanks, Sharon.
Well, freedom fighters, how good was that? To get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello@khgroup.com.au. That's HELLO at khgroup.com.au. Or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au/getinvested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening, and as always, dream as if you'll live forever and live as if you'll die tomorrow.